And welcome back to Hannity. Now, even before the Zimmerman trial began, some of the mainstream media had already declared the defendant a guilty man. And what was even more troubling, a racially charged narrative was scripted without any trace of evidence to back that up. The most blatant example was orchestrated by the so-called journalists over at NBC News who deceptively edited a 911 call that was placed by Zimmerman to make it sound like he had racially profiled Trayvon Martin. Now, moments after the not guilty verdict was handed down, the Zimmerman defense team had very strong words for the mainstream media. Watch.
Two systems went against George Zimmerman that he can't understand. You guys, the media, he was like a patient in an operating table where mad scientists were committing experiments on him and he had no anesthesia. He didn't know why he was turned into this monster, but quite honestly, you guys had a lot to do with it. You just did, because you took a story that was fed to you and you ran with it and you ran right over him. And that was horrid to him.
And still in the studio, we continue with Zimmerman defense attorneys Mark O'Mara and Don West. I was glad you did that because they were guilty of this.
They truly were. I mean, you look at this in the beginning, what happened was they didn't know any better because they were given a well-crafted story fed to them with a picture of a 12-year-old child and a 275-pound George Zimmerman, and they gave a great narrative that that person had to kill this young black child of 12 years of age. It was just fantasy. It was just completely made up, and unfortunately, the media just ran with it because it was so compelling a story. I'm hoping that the media has now learned. It will never happen again that you look at a story fed to you and not do what journalists were taught to do 50 years ago, look at your sources and vet it out.
Richard Jewell, he fit the profile of the lone bomber. After all, he lived with his mother. That was one case. The Duke lacrosse case was another recent example.
Sure.
All right, let's talk about the President of the United States. If I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. His only reaction to the verdict is, well, let's talk about gun control.
Well, the first comment, I really think that he also bought hook, line, and sinker, although he's got the best research team in the universe. He bought that hook, line, and sinker because if he had actually vetted it out, if he had looked at the real pictures of George Zimmerman and the real pictures of Trayvon Martin before he made that comment, I don't think he ever would have made the comment. Having done that and having sort of now used the power of his office for that purpose, he really had an opportunity when the verdict came down to rebalance things, to say, look, a jury heard this case, they decided the case, and he is an innocent man who used self-defense. Let's take this lesson and move forward positively. Instead, he sort of suggests again, gun control needs to be revisited. George Zimmerman used that gun properly after waiting 45 seconds. Why not acknowledge that?
Yeah, what was your reaction, Don?
George Zimmerman acted in lawful self-defense. He did what he had the absolute right to do to save his own life, and he did. Mm-hmm. This wasn't a hate crime. If it had been a hate crime, he would have been prosecuted for a hate crime by the state prosecutor. That exists under Florida law. To suggest even now, after the verdict speaks so loudly, that this is still an issue is very troubling. I agree with Mark. The opportunity was there to speak strongly about what this jury's verdict really says.
What do you think about Eric Holder and the news of the day that they're considering reopening what had been opened before, civil rights charges against George?
This started a year ago when they brought down the FBI and did a full investigation of whether or not George Zimmerman violated Trayvon Martin's civil rights. They talked to about 40 witnesses. We have all of it. It's all in discovery. And every one of those witnesses said George is a meek, mild guy without a racist bone in his body. And we already have that information. I think the suggestion that they're going to look at it is just placating those people who they want to placate to believe that there's still some investigation going on.
Didn't George Zimmerman date a black woman at the prom, take one to the prom, and didn't he mentor black children on weekends?
At the time this happened, he was mentoring 2 young black children. Even though the mentoring program had been disbanded, he kept it up. He had black children living with him in his home from the time he was 6 to the time he was 12. He did bring a black girl from Barbados, I think, to the prom. And he was the guy who went after Sanford PD when they didn't do enough when the Sherman Ware black homeless guy was beat up by the white cop.
Yeah. A lot of people in the country tried to make this all about race and black versus white. Isn't George Hispanic?
No, he's white Hispanic.
White Hispanic?
Yes. He used to be Hispanic.
Self-alleged Hispanic, I read, I think, in the AP. Self-proclaimed, I think it was.
Hispanic, but the story was written before they realized he was Hispanic. So they had, instead of changing the story to acknowledge their fault, they made up a new word called white Hispanic.
What are the unanswered questions both of you have after this case? Is there anything you want to know about this case? I have one question. I'm just asking maybe what you have.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I have my suspicions. I would love to have a crystal ball to know precisely what the impetus for this prosecution was. I know what I think it was. I would like to see some letter, some email that documents my suspicions, because I have no idea why they took an absolutely obvious self-defense case and turned it into a case that, though they thought it would do some good in a strange way, ended up dividing the country. It's going to take us years to get past the Zimmerman verdict when it was a just verdict, and we can't have the opportunity for the conversations we should have about other things wrong with the justice system.
Don, is there one I would like to know myself? Why did Trayvon feel the need to punch George and then get on top of him? I don't know. Why did that happen? I don't know.
We know that he had plenty of time to think about it. I think the evidence proved conclusively that there were about 4 minutes in between the time that it was clear from the testimony that Trayvon Martin ran and essentially lost George Zimmerman. And then 4 minutes later, the confrontation took place. What went through Trayvon Martin's mind, we don't know, except he made a conscious decision to engage. He had to go somewhere and come back, or simply wait around for George Zimmerman to get off the phone and, in many respects, be vulnerable.
Yeah. What do you make of this, the NAACP comments that have been made, and the violence in Oakland, L.A., and other cities? What do you make of that?
I'm troubled by it for a couple of reasons. One, it's dividing the country. And two, it's evidencing a failure to trust a system that we have to trust. We have to believe in our criminal justice system so that people will still use it and people will trust in it. And if they don't, then we get back into the type of justice in the streets that we shouldn't do. And I'm very worried about that.
What did you think of the comment? You kind of dismissed it in closing, creepy-ass cracker. What did that tell you, though, in your mind?
You know, I will dismiss it again. I think that's a 17-year-old talking, and I'm okay with that. I said words when I was 17 I probably shouldn't have said. I don't know that that meant that there was a racial overtone to that. Could it be argued? Yes. But I think that Trayvon Martin didn't know what was going on. I don't think George Zimmerman fully knew what Trayvon was doing, and I don't think Trayvon Martin fully knew what George was doing. But the one who reacted most improperly with violence seemingly was Trayvon Martin.
Yeah. What did you think of Rachel Gentile, who was their star witness? Any thoughts? Either one?
I think that she was in a position where she didn't want to be involved in this case at all. If I had a crystal ball, I think her mom and Mrs. Fulton had a conversation where her mom said words like, "You go tell that mom what happened to her son now." Sort of brought her into it. She modified and sort of glossed over her testimony in order to make it more palatable to the mom. And she did it, of course, in the initial interview, the absurd interview with Mr. Crump.
That was crazy.
Well, worse than that, because you can almost say Mr. Crump didn't know what else to do, but then it happens again with Mr. De La Rionda, who allows an interview to take place on the couch with the crying mom of the decedent right next to the witness.
Didn't you think it was helpful? A lot of people commented on both the walkthrough that George did with the police and then the interview that he did with me, and that the prosecution brought George's story in his own voice in twice in full. Helpful to your defense? Net plus? Any negative to that?
Video is pretty powerful, isn't it? George Zimmerman told his story for the world to see, and told it to you too.
Yeah.
Powerful stuff.
And then people, the prosecutors in the end said it was cowardly for George Zimmerman not to take the stand. And I'm like, he told his story twice. You introduced it as evidence.
How dare they denigrate the jury verdict in this case by suggesting anything other than it was a just verdict?
The comment in my interview about God's will, now as a religious person, I know that everybody kind of, as a Christian, believes that's God's will. That's a state of mind. Did that worry you? Because they kept harping on it.
I've said it several times when I've lost my mom, my dad, and my sister. You have to, when you don't understand why something happened, when you can't fathom why something happened, and you're Christian or Catholic or religious, you say it's God's plan, which means, I think, I don't know why it happened, but I'm willing to accept it. It came across somewhat insensitive with the people who want to suggest it was insensitive, but that's not the way George meant it.
All right, last question, and I have to ask you.
No.
I have to. It's my job. Do you regret the knock-knock joke that got so much attention?
Yes.
You want him to say yes?
I regret having not told it better. I do.
You regret he sold it?
No. Well,
Yes, he does. He's shaking his head. Yes.
can I say what the objective was?
No.
Yeah. No.
Yes.
The objective was, if you heard what the prosecutor said and the way he said it, the passion, the glaring, the staring, the condemnation, a raw appeal to emotion, I knew I couldn't follow that act. There had to be a disconnect so that the jury would think of something else other than what he had just said, which I knew they couldn't prove.
All right, I'll let you two fight it out after dinner. Hey, thank you both for stopping by.
Great to
And
see you.
congratulations on